Hi, everybody. It's Deirdre, and this is Safely Embodied podcast. And I wanted to talk to Russell Kolts, who I have known about for many, many years. I have all his books, seen his TED Talk, which you all have to see, and I'll put a link for it. But this is the first time I've actually talked to him live in person, so I'm thrilled. I know about Russell through compassion-focused therapy, which is something, a therapy that I have really trained myself and schooled myself in because personally, I think it's so important to be able to turn toward myself and turn toward others with compassion. And that's what Russell and I are going to talk about. We started talking about it. I said, no, you can't keep talking. You've got to record. So he is a professor of psychology. He's a political psychologist, and he's a professor of psychology at Eastern Washington University, where he's taught for over 18 years. And they've lucky enough to have been with him for that long. And in fact, he's gotten numerous awards, including being the Faculty of the Year twice. Pretty cool there. He's written a number of books. One, The Compassionate Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger. The other, An Open-Hearted Life, about transformative lessons for compassionate living, that he wrote with a nun, which is quite a beautiful Buddhist nun. And CFT Made Simple, which I have right here. And I also have clients read it. It's not just for therapists because it's really easy and practical.
Oh, thank you for saying that. That makes me very happy to hear.
Oh, good. No, I have people look at it, all kinds of people, because it's, you can actually get a sense of what to do with it. And then again, his TED Talk, which I want you all to look at. And then, Russell, you also have a new book coming out, Experiencing Compassion-Focused Therapy from the Inside Out. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's
yeah. I'm really excited about it, actually. For years, I think lots of people who teach CFT and who do CFT have said things like, if you're going to use compassion or compassion-focused therapy with your clients, you really need to practice it yourself. I think mindfulness is the same way. I think mindfulness teachers know that, you can learn about mindfulness all day long, but if you don't practice it, you can really have no understanding of what it is and how it works. And and I'd even done some web trainings and things in the past called CFT from the Inside Out. And so about 2 years ago, James Bennett Levy, who's an Australian psychologist who really is probably the top person in the world doing work in therapists, self-practice, and self-reflection, right? Therapists learning to do models of therapy by doing the practices of those therapy models themselves and then reflecting on that practice and doing some reflective writing and things like this. And so James had contacted me to see if I'd be interested in doing a self-practice, self-reflection book for CFT, and I was real excited. And we then invited Tobin Bell and Chris Irons to join with us on the book. And I'm actually reviewing the page proofs this week, so it'll be out in April, and I'm happy with it. So I hope it'll be kind of a useful thing for people to use, and I hope it'll be a nice adjunct to people who are using CFT Made Simple to learn CFT. So you learn about the therapy and then practice it, from the inside out.
What did you find as you were doing that? What opened up for you?
Well, the interesting thing in terms of doing the book, the primary challenge for us is that there's a lot of theoretical material in CFT. We've got a lot of very thick books that go through a lot of information. And we tried to basically create a book that was kind of the opposite of that. So there's actually a very brief presentation of theoretical material. Everything about the book is organized to get the person into practicing the practice and then having them think about what that was like for them. What did they notice? What was helpful? What obstacles came up? How might they work with those obstacles? And then to do what James calls, he calls a reflective bridge. So bridging from the personal self to the therapist self. So observing, this is how this worked in my life, and then thinking, okay, what implications does that have for my practice as a therapist using this with my clients? What can I take from my personal experience to enrich that experience in working with my clients? And so for me, that's kind of what stood out for me because it kind of paralleled the process of therapy in a way where the emphasis is really on making the learning experiential and giving ways for people to connect whatever it is they're doing and learning with their lived experience to really bring it alive.
I think that's essential. I know I'm a big fan and I've done the work myself. That's what makes it a lived experience. So I'm all for that. And it helps me then. Let's segue to this idea we were talking about earlier about getting triggered, because so many of the people I work with get triggered.
Yeah.
And, we can't seem to slow it down, and it's happening. And like you talk about in your TED Talk, it happens so quickly, it takes over. So how do we slow it down? What are the complications around that? And then also, we started talking about motivation, and I'd like to have a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that? How do we get the motivation to change when we've tried and tried and tried and nothing ever seems to work? So that's an opening statement.
So that really robs one's motivation if you're thinking, gosh, nothing's helped.
Right.
Probably nothing will help. Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to talking about that. So the first question was about being triggered and how quickly we can get caught up in something and even the motivation we might have, we don't even remember it. But before I talk about how to slow that down or how to work with it, I want to underscore a central message of CFT, which is that the way our brains evolved and the way emotions play out in us is inherently tricky for reasons that are really no fault of our own. We didn't design our brains to work in this way. So when you describe that experience of being triggered and then we focus on whatever that is and we're caught up in it and we're just right there and it's just moving so quickly and there's a sense of urgency and it is so tricky. I think a lot of people who have that experience interpret it in a shaming way. They think the fact that this happens this way for me means there's something wrong with me, right? It means that I'm bad.
I'm out of control.
I'm out of control, or it's something that's bad about me. And, the first thing I want to say around that is that actually, no, it's not something that's wrong with you. In fact, our brains evolved to respond to threat in exactly this manner, right? Those threat responses, fear, anxiety, anger, particularly the fear and anger, they evolved to activate us rapidly in response to primarily physical threats. And so when there's a threat to your life right there, we can imagine how that would be adaptive for our ancestors to be triggered immediately, to very quickly have their entire focus shift toward that threat. And everything about their mind and their bodies is organized about how do I respond? What do I do to keep myself, in this case, physically safe? And so when we get triggered and we find ourselves reacting so powerfully, that's actually our brains doing what many, many, many years of evolution designed them to do. We're biased towards exactly that sort of processing. And of course, because of differences in temperament and individual differences and how we were raised, those experiences can occur more powerfully in some people than others. But really, all of our brains were designed to respond to threat in precisely this manner. So if you're someone who, like me, didn't come into the world with a really cool, calm, relaxed temperament, that can be very frustrating. The fact that you're getting triggered all the time and you have this big threat response coming up and that feels out of control. And so I think one of the things you mentioned when we were talking, I think it was before we started recording, but you mentioned in the TEDx talk I did, I mentioned that we have actually quite a lot of good anger management techniques and strategies. The problem is people don't use them. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one of those reasons is that there's a lot of shame associated with anger. So I think a lot of times it's hard for people to say, I have an anger problem. We tend to avoid that realization in a lot of different ways, like by blaming the anger on other people, right? I only got angry at you because you did that, right? Or we rationalize. We talk to our friends, I had the right to be angry about this, right? So we, rather than dealing with the anger as a problem or as something we need to focus on, we avoid it in these different ways. And so the first thing I think we need to do is to actually decide, I want to work with my anger or my fear. Or I want to work with this getting triggered business, right? I want to be able to do something with that. In terms of slowing things down, there are a lot of things we can do, and CFT has a lot of those practices built in. Soothing rhythm breathing works wonderfully. We've got some great imagery practices and things like this. But the really tricky bit, from my experience, is people noticing when they get hooked. It's noticing the trigger, noticing I just got triggered, and so I need to maybe slow down my breath, or it would be helpful to do this or do that. And so my best answer to what do we do about being triggered is to find ways to do a better job of noticing it as soon as possible when it happens. Now, there are a lot of ways to do that. I think actually in my anger book, but certainly in the group manual I did, there's actually a fair bit of repetition around having people identify the situations that tend to trigger them. So it's a lot easier to notice when you get triggered if you're already kind of looking out for it. So if you know that I tend to get triggered when people cut me off in traffic, then when you start to pull on the freeway, you can kind of bring a little awareness. Okay, this is the situation in which I tend to be triggered. So what am I going to do if it happened? How am I going to work with this, right? If you've been having lots of difficult interactions with your partner, and what happens is when you come home and you've had a crappy day, and he or she comes home and they've had a crappy day, and you meet in the kitchen, and then one of them says something reflecting the crappy day, and that triggers you. Then when you get home first, you can remind yourself, okay, this is the time in which the negative interaction, the trigger tends to happen. So what can I prepare? How can I prepare to engage with my partner in a way that won't fuel that anger or whatever that is when he or she gets in, right? So for example, one thing that I do when I get home is I know that my wife, Lisa, when she gets home, if our counters, we walk in from the garage and you're immediately in the kitchen. And if our counters are cluttered and there's a bunch of stuff everywhere, that's stressful for her. But I've also learned that if I get home first and I clean up the counters and I make it so it's nice and kind of tidy, and then she comes home and she feels really happy because she's greeted by this like clean kitchen, and that makes her feel good. And just that one thing sets us up to have an entirely different set of interactions than if I had just left the counters cluttered.
Right.
Right. So I think the one thing we can do is we become really familiar with the situations that tend to trigger us so that we can kind of plan ahead or be aware before it happens. The second thing I think that's really useful in working with triggers is mindfulness practice. And that can be formal mindfulness training through, for example, kind of mindful breathing, right? So you're centering the breath, your attention on the breath, and just training yourself to notice when your attention wanders. What's interesting is when I teach mindful breathing, the most common obstacle that comes up for people is they get really frustrated when when they get distracted, when their mind goes away, when they're thinking about something. And what I try to convey to them is actually, no, you need that to happen, because it's through noticing, oh, look, I'm thinking, and coming back to the breath. That's how we learn to notice movement in the mind, right? We begin to notice when a thought takes us away or the arriving of a feeling and things like that. And so that can maybe help us learn to recognize the feeling of being triggered. If we can notice that feeling of when our mind shifts and an emotion arises or something, anything that allows us to go, oh, look, I just experienced a wave of anger. Just that little shift in awareness from being in it to being able to go, oh, look at what happens, opens us up to an entire range of stuff we can do to work with it. So mindful breathing is great. For people working in the prison with people who struggle with anger, I met some, I'm going to use the male pronoun because it was a men's prison. I met some guys who, they just didn't want anything to do with anything that smacked of meditation, right? They didn't want to watch their breath. They didn't want to do that because And some of that, there were lots of reasons for this that people can have. So I developed something called a mindful check-in, which basically you're just training people to like quickly notice, how does my body feel, right? What's going on my body on the outside? What do I notice on my internal bodily sensations? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? And it's actually much less like a meditation than a behavioral self-monitoring strategy, where you're basically training the attention to notice internal experiences, thinking, and feeling, so that that becomes part of what you notice, part of what enters your sphere of awareness at regular intervals, right? Just as you would notice if the sun comes out or shifts in your physical environment. And so I think if we can train ourselves through these different ways to notice when we get triggered, that's the most important part. And then we can be kind of exploratory and kind of playfully in figuring out, okay, what works best for me when I'm triggered in slowing things down? Is it slowing down my breath? Is it, reminding myself of what my real motivation is in this relationship and how I want this person to experience me? Is it, so for example, my son is 12. And so if you can imagine, 12-year-olds are very good at doing things that are kind of vexing. They're very good at pushing adult buttons and sometimes do it purposefully. And certainly my son sometimes does. And as someone who's kind of prone to irritability and anger, it would be really easy for me to be really angry at him a lot of the time. But if I can, the moment I see that irritation arise, if I can remind myself that actually I don't want my son to experience me as a raving, angry father. I want him to feel safe when he's around me. I want him to feel comfortable sharing things with me. If I can remind myself of how I want him to experience me, what I find is that actually my anger tends to soften quite a lot just as a result of bringing that awareness into my mind, doing some perspective taking, imagining how it makes sense from his point of view that he would behave this way, right? Because a lot of times the stuff that drives me crazy, the perspective of the other person, it makes complete sense that they would say or behave in whatever manner. So the idea is once we notice that we've been triggered and we can go, oh, look, I was triggered, it opens the door to asking a question like, okay, given this is what just happened, what would be helpful? And what I would encourage is that people spend their lives kind of developing a list of stuff that tends to be helpful for me when I feel threatened. I'm continually adding that list and developing it and thinking about what are the things I can do that helps me get back to feeling safe, that helps me balance out those feelings of threat. And of course, when I'm working with clients, a big part of it is that's always a collaborative exercise where we kind of work together to figure out what are the things that help you get, that help you get back to that place you want to be when you're triggered.
So a lot of what you're talking about is reflection, being able to reflect on yourself and your experience.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the reason that starts, well, I should say that can happen 2 times. That can happen before we've been triggered, and the reflection part can happen after we've slowed things down. But the important thing to validate in people is that when we've been triggered, it's almost impossible to reflect in that moment. And the reason is our threat system is doing what they're designed to do. We're not, the ancestors that when the tiger jumped out, sat and reflected, they got eaten, right? The ancestors that lived to pass their genes along to us are the ones that mobilized, that activated through fear, anger, things like this. So it's very hard to be reflective if we can't first connect with experiences of safeness. And so this kind of 1-2 process of noticing, ooh, I just got triggered, and then asking, what would be helpful in helping me feel safe in this moment? And then I'll decide what to do about the situation. So in the anger groups I've done, one of the things that was very clear is when we get triggered, one of the things that needs to be triggered is a shift in our focus from dealing with the situation, whatever that is, to working with my emotions first. And once I'm a little more balanced, then I can come back and deal with whatever this situation is. Because most of the time, the situations in our lives aren't physical threats that have to be responded to in moments, right? They're things that we can more nuanced social situations that we actually can pause and slow down and spend some time making sense of first.
It's interesting. I'm sitting with this idea of course, how important safety is, but aware of how often people will say, well, they can't do something, or they can't reflect, or they can't notice what's going on because or it's not even conscious, the idea of the lack of safety, and how to engender a sense of safety. Is that first? Is that does safety allow us to become able to notice? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the things that happens when our threat systems are activated, when we feel threatened, scared, angry, anxious, whatever, there's a narrowing of our attention and of our thinking and reasoning and of our mental imagery, and our whole mind and body becomes organized around this experience of threat, which makes it very tricky. So the more we can learn how to kind of exist in the world in a way that feels a little more safe, the more we're going to be able to notice those sorts of things. But I also think it's possible we can't stop the threat triggering, although over time I think it softens as we begin to kind of cultivate a more compassionate way of being in the world. But it's always going to be there. I long since realized that my irritability response will always be there, right? That's just kind of a part of where I'm wired up. But if we can train ourselves to notice, to be familiar with the situations in which it happens, and to, in the way we were talking about with mindfulness, to notice when it happens, then, the fact that I'm angry or the fact that I'm anxious or afraid isn't the problem. The problem is when I jump on that train and then start acting blindly from the perspective of those emotions. So if I can notice that, and then, even recognizing, wow, I'm really freaked out right now. I'm really, whatever that is I'm feeling, to then connect with that, what would be helpful in slowing it down. So you're right. There is a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing.
Or maybe they happen in tandem, Russell, that building safety and building awareness or noticing happens at the same time.
Well, absolutely. And the other thing that develops, I think it's almost kind of this iterative kind of experience where you're kind of covering the same ground, going around the loop again and again and again, and you become more familiar with it. So, for example, the better you get at noticing and then dealing or working with whatever the emotion is, the less likely you're going to get so triggered, because there's a sense of confidence around, well, if something happens, I can deal with it, right? If something happens, I'll find a way. So like, relationships, when people develop the skills to repair ruptures in relationships, and they learn that, we can disagree and we can even get into a little bit of a tiff, but that doesn't mean the end of the relationship. It doesn't mean everything's over. Once people really learn that, and they learn that I have skills to work with whatever that is, then they also become a lot less likely to be triggered, and they have a lot fewer blow-ups, because there's not that underlying experience of threat underneath it that says if there is a blow-up, then the relationship's gone or whatever. Right. So I think you're right. It's kind of all happening at the same time.
Can we touch into, because at some point you said, underneath anger and our reactivity are a lot of more vulnerable fears. So we're threatened because we think something's getting taken away or going to get hurt, or so there's underneath is some more vulnerability. Is that where shame sort of comes into play?
Oh, I think shame surrounds the experience of anger in a lot of people. Anger is an interesting emotion in that it is both a primary threat emotion and a secondary emotion. So I want to make clear, anger isn't only, it's not necessarily the case that underneath every experience of anger is something vulnerable like fear or anxiety. Because sometimes, if you're being physically attacked or something like that, you can have a pure anger response. I mean, it's one of the few basic emotions we have. But it also very often serves as a secondary emotion that's kind of layered on top of fear or sadness. And this is particularly true in males, because at least in Western culture, males are often socialized not to express vulnerable emotions. And when you teach someone that expressing those emotions is bad, it's very easy for them then to sort out that actually feeling them is bad too. I really shouldn't have that experience at all. And so I think that's absolutely kind of what you're getting at, that when we observe something about ourselves that we think is unacceptable, I mean, that's shame, right? When we look at this, say, this is something that's wrong with me. This is something that's bad about me. I mean, that's almost the definition of shame. And so that really sets the stage then for, I think, anger to occur. Now, because you're raising the threat, or you're lowering the threat threshold, right? The person's already kind of preloaded with this experience of threat that's based on their own observations of their emotional experience. Now, I think in some people, not all, but I think in some people who struggle with anger, the other thing that happens is that shame is then added to by the shame of observing yourself hurting the people you care about. People who struggle with anger quite commonly will say or do things that causes a lot of pain in the people they love. And then, you say that stuff because you're kind of out of control in this threatened kind of triggered space. But then very quickly, if you see the signs in the other person of that they're hurt, or that they're withdrawing, or that they're in some way reacting negatively towards you, I think that can trigger a lot of shame in people, which then tends to trigger those avoidance strategies we talked about earlier, blaming, rationalizing, anything but going, oh my gosh, I just totally hurt someone I care about and I don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's really what we want to connect with. Not the shame, not saying I'm a bad person because I did that, but some guilt, some feeling of, I just hurt someone I care about and I don't want to be someone who hurts someone I care about, which can lend itself to responsibility taking, and then that willingness to say, okay, I've got a problem with anger. I want to do something about it.
I'm sitting with the whole piece of shame as not even just an underneath the anger response, but the shame of not being worth speaking up, or not being worth communicating or being part of the world in any which way. And so that level of vulnerability.
Yeah. I've heard that. I'm doing a couple classes this quarter, a CFT course, but also a diversity course. And I'm having the students do a lot of reflective writing. And I've had a number of students hit on exactly the theme that you're talking about, this idea of not having a voice and feeling kind of simultaneously like unworthy of having a voice, but also having a lot of anger around that. Right? So I think you're hitting on something that's real there.
Right. I think maybe that's where compassion is so necessary as a way to, I don't want to use the word, I'm not sure, normalize, but there's a way of containing or buffering or something like that. This is something that happens to people. They don't feel worth it, especially if they've missed some underlying attachment needs.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I think the word normalize is not a bad one there. I think validate is another good one. Basically, to help the person relate to their experiences in a way that they can recognize, hey, it makes sense that I would struggle with this. Given the way my brain evolved, given the way my, caregiving history, played out, given all of these things, it makes sense that I would struggle with this. It would make sense that I would have these fears or whatever that is.
So some of it is to then be able to validate and reassure.
Absolutely.
Do you think that, actually I'm sitting with that, do you think that compassion in many ways is reassuring? Would that be appropriate?
I don't know. I mean, when you said reassure, I said absolutely. And then I thought, well, in a way, reassuring in the sense that this is a normal part of the human experience.
Right.
This is something that happens. It makes sense that you struggle with this. Lots of us struggle with it. All of us struggle with some of this stuff. So that reassuring in that sense. What compassion is not, I think, is reassuring in the more naive, everything's going to work out okay sense. Because sometimes things don't work out okay. Sometimes sometimes there's not an easy answer. In fact, most of the time there's not an easy answer to things. So compassion really is about helping people work with whatever suffering shows up. And hopefully even with the causes and conditions behind that. So it's maybe in the future not so much suffering is there. But it's not necessarily, it's not really reassuring in the sense of saying, and one day the suffering will go away and there won't be any more. In fact, the message is really the opposite, which is that having a human life entails a certain amount of pain and discomfort. And rather than being afraid of that or rejecting of that, what if we could just say, yeah, this is what it's like. Some days are going to be really hard. They're going to be really difficult. And when that happens, then instead of going, oh, this is awful, this is terrible, it shouldn't be this way, I can go, oh, of course. Right. Of course, this is what it's like. This happens sometimes. What would be helpful? So here we're seeing another kind of thread woven into compassion, which is really mindful acceptance. That ability to, whatever you're experiencing, to look at that and go, without judging it as good, bad, right, wrong, etc., to go, oh, okay, this is what it's like for me right now. I think Tara Brach uses that phrase, and I love it. Oh, this is what it's like right now. And then, given this, what would be helpful?
Right. I think of it as, who do I want to be right now? Because whatever the circumstances are, who do I want to be? Not who my history has programmed me to be. Yeah,
absolutely. And hopefully who you want to be right now is someone who understands that the way the history has programmed you creates some difficulties, right? So one of the things we want in CFT is for the person to develop a version of the self that is compassionate, not only towards facing the problems in the world, but in the way it directs attention towards the other versions of the self. So that the compassionate version of me can look at the version of me that struggles with anger, and instead of condemning that angry version of me, say, gosh, it makes a whole lot of sense that you're struggling, that we're struggling with this, and remind me of the things that are helpful in working with that, right? So there's this kindness toward even the aspects of the self that we might be tempted to reject or feel ashamed of. I'm going to quickly close my blinds just a little more.
Getting too much light in your eyes, huh?
Well, I find that if I lean a certain way, it's, yeah.
The light is shining on you, Russell.
And that's almost always a good thing. That works much better.
Well, this is really good. I'm just sitting with this. There was one other question I had, but I want to be respectful of your time too. And there's something about when those times when we're kind of resistant or pushing away compassion, and maybe it's more around the deservability or not worth it, that level. You want to say anything about that?
Well, one of the things that has really been a focus of CFT for the last several years, actually, Paul Gilbert's been talking a lot about it, and it's so important. A lot of compassion-focused therapy has to do with dealing with blocks and resistance to compassion, to being treated kindly and supportively by others, or to relate that way to ourselves, or in that third flow, to relate that way to others. We're a tricky species. And so we're sort of wired up. Our default mode really is that to feel safe through connection with others, people who accept us and like us and value us and all that. And so if we have kind of these secure early attachment relationships, if we have these caregivers who are able to do that consistently, when we're distressed, they're there for us and they let us know that they love us and believe us and they validate us and support us and all that. What that does is it really opens up that innate potential we have to feel safe through connection. And we're kind of wired to do that anyway. So it really is nice. But a lot of us have caregivers who, for whatever reason, and there's always a context in which it makes sense, aren't able to do that for us. And so maybe they get so distressed when they see our discomfort that they escalate so much that the balance shifts and it's about them. Or maybe they just, for whatever reason, they're not able to be there to nurture us when we need things like this. But the point is that if we don't have those experiences early of being associating connection with safeness and being comforted and being helped, particularly when we're distressed or threatened, then we learn very different things. And we can learn to panic in the face of threat and discomfort because we don't know how to regulate and nobody's helping us. We can learn to avoid our emotions and just try and shut them off, right? So in avoidant attachment, you see a lot of this. People just saying, I'm not going to feel it, right? And the other thing we learn is, or fail to learn, is how to connect with others and how to feel safe through that connection. Because although we're wired to be able to do that, our basic attachment experiences can activate certain genes, and they really either develop certain potentials or they don't. And so if we're someone who didn't have those so important early kind of nurturing experiences, and instead perhaps maybe even were abused or have some kind of traumatic interpersonal experiences or things like this, we can learn to not feel comfortable in connection with others. And so that instead of feeling safe when connection starts coming up, we can feel threatened, or we can feel uncomfortable, or we can feel freaked out, or just weird because it doesn't feel right. And it doesn't feel right. That's not something that's wrong with us. That's because the neural architecture that supports feeling safe through connection wasn't nurtured and developed. So, through those experiences. And so I think that can be very tricky for people. So I think, there can be a narrative sense of I'm not worthy, I don't deserve this. But I think below that even is something even trickier, which is just not feeling comfortable with connection, feeling threatened or uncomfortable or whatever with that. And that's why in CFT Made Simple, and in a lot of the work I've been doing in workshops lately, I've been really emphasizing the therapeutic relationship a lot in those trainings, because I think a big part of all of this in therapy is helping create a context of relational safeness for our clients, in which they can begin to learn and establish the neural architecture that's associated with that learning to feel that connected with someone else, to learn that actually there are people who will care about me and will validate me and who won't hurt me or won't disappear just when I need them or whatever their fears might be. And I think, if we're able to do that as a therapist, to kind of serve as a secure attachment figure for our clients, and they can begin to do that process of learning, then that can generalize to other relationships in their lives, and they can learn to value those relationships. And, but I think there's that two layers. There's the content level stuff, but underneath that so often is the kind of basic feeling. Do I feel safe in this experience or do I not?
And changing the implicit connection where they're rewiring so that... Absolutely. And that's tricky to do. And it's tricky to do precisely because our brains evolved to adapt very quickly and efficiently to threatening circumstances, because our ancestors' survival required them to adapt quickly and efficiently. Our brains aren't designed to adapt to safeness. They're not designed to adapt efficiently to the threat's gone. So that requires, I think, a lot more patience when we've learned to feel threatened by something. I think that's right. I think you're absolutely right about that. Right.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the time, the deliberateness, the practice. We talked earlier about the tools, using our tools, and where people get hung up on is not wanting to, but that practice takes time and it's hard work.
Yeah. And I can want to and not want to.
Right.
Not feel like it.
Right.
I can theoretically know this would be good for me, but it doesn't feel comfortable. I don't feel like I want to.
Right. Oh, so good. So good.
So I want to finish that comment with one more thing, because I think bridging from that, I think it's almost impossible to overemphasize the difference in terms of being in the world if you're someone who experiences safeness through connection with others versus being someone who doesn't. Right. And I think these are two very different ways of being in the world. And if you're someone who lives here, it can be very hard to understand what this is like, and vice versa.
Right.
And so I think we probably can't talk about that enough.
I agree completely. And I'm actually finding in the online courses I teach and in the online learning community I teach that people are finding it's safer and safer to start taking those risks. Whereas before they might not have. Now in this protected environment, they can take some chances and come forward. And then that's actually letting them go out into the world and do it in another way with real people, not that we're not real in the course, but it's another step. And I just think that it's the cultivation and the flourishing that's happening. It's so beautiful.
It is wonderful. And I think you're right. I think, when you have these different environments that people can engage in, there can be a little separation built in so that they can experience connection at an intensity that they can handle and that they can manage, and that they can begin to kind of increase the dose. Because what you're saying is so important. If you're someone who has learned to associate connection with threat, you can't just decide to feel safe. You can't just do that. And so relearning, changing that wiring, it necessarily entails a lot of vulnerability and feeling uncomfortable, because you have to put yourself in those experiences of connection so your brain can learn, oh, wait, I didn't get hurt. That was actually helpful. They understood. They seemed to care. I can feel safe. And that takes time. And so giving people a context to do that in a way that they can handle, I think is so valuable.
Context and dosage.
Absolutely.
You said earlier, you put a toe in and then you can get the heck out. And,
absolutely. Well put.
Well, Russell and everybody, I know I'm certainly pre-ordering your book now, and I want everybody else to, so we can be right there on the forefront of this cutting edge work that you're putting out there. So very much thank you for this, Russell, and for giving your time to us.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and I was honored to be asked. And I should say I'm a big admirer of your work, too. I sort of follow what you're doing on social media, and I'm really impressed. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. It's all from the heart.
That's obvious.
Right,
that's very clear.
Right. Peace. All right, my dear. We will catch up at some other point in life.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye-bye.